Do you think the FIA made a fair decision in sanctioning Oscar Piastri for the incident in Brazil? Or are we facing a new case of arbitrariness that could change the history of the championship? The 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix will go down in history not only for the chaos and emotions typical of Interlagos, but for a specific event that unleashed a wave of unprecedented indignation in the paddock, the sanction imposed on Oscar Piastri. In a maneuver that, according to many experts and drivers, fits perfectly within the spectrum of what has traditionally been considered a racing incident, the FIA decided to penalize the Australian driver with 10 seconds, thus modifying not only his immediate result, but also the course of the championship. It all started on lap 6, just when the competition restarted after a safety car period. The group of cars was completely compressed. The tension was palpable and each driver knew that this was one of the few moments to gain positions without depending exclusively on the pit strategy or the pace in long runs. Piastri, starting from an advantageous position in 4th, saw an opportunity opening up as they approached turn 1, one of the most critical points on the Brazilian layout. In front he had Kimi Antonelli, debutant Mercedes driver, and on the outside came Charles Leclerc with the Ferrari trying to stay out of the conflict. It was a typical elite play. 3 cars paired together, fighting for the same piece of track in one of the most vulnerable moments of the race. Piastri opted for the interior, choosing the riskiest but also potentially most profitable path. From the telemetry it could be observed that he braked even before his rivals, which denotes not only caution, but also respect for the dangerous environment. However, that caution was not enough. At the exact moment Antonelli began to close the line towards the apex of the corner, Piastri, already committed to the inside line, momentarily locked his left front wheel. An attempt to stop the car to avoid contact which did not achieve its goal. The McLaren clipped the front wheel of the Mercedes, destabilizing it just enough to cause a side spin that sent it directly into Leclerc's path. The Ferrari at that moment had no room to react. The blow was severe and the red car was automatically knocked out of action. What was dramatic was not only the triple collision nor the immediate consequence in terms of Leclerc's abandonment. What was really striking was how the stewards applied the technical regulations. The current regulations, based on a geometric interpretation of overtaking, established that for a driver to have the right to space on the inside of a curve, he must have placed the front axle of his car at least at the height of the rearview mirror of the car he intends to overtake. In this case, the stewards determined that Piastri had not reached that minimum overlap before the apex, so they placed full blame on him for the incident. This criterion has historically been the subject of controversy. Real race conditions, especially in situations of relaunching and group compression, rarely allow for a literal application of these regulations without falling into arbitrariness. What in other contexts has been interpreted as a race incident, in Brazil became a decisive sanction that could change the outcome of the championship. Piastri not only lost time on the track, he lost a key position in the overall standings, leaving him 24 points behind his teammate Lando Norris with only 3 events left. Piastri's case raises a crucial question. To what extent is the FIA willing to relax its interpretation of the rules when track circumstances demand it? And even more so, is the maneuver being judged by its execution or by its consequences? The answer to this question will be decisive for the future of the sport. Because deep down, what is at stake is not just a race. It is the very essence of competitive motorsports, the right to fight wheel to wheel. The decision to sanction Oscar Piastri not only had effects on the standings or the development of the championship. It was a detonation that emotionally shook the entire paddock. What happened in Brazil was not simply an isolated disagreement with a specific sanction. It was the boiling point of an accumulation of pent-up frustrations. The stewards' trial not only unleashed indignation from those around McLaren, but also generated a common front of criticism from drivers, former drivers, analysts, and important figures within the sport. It was a rare display of unity in a paddock usually divided by individual interests. One of the first to raise his voice was, curiously, the one most affected by the accident, Charles Leclerc. Logic would dictate that the Ferrari driver, a direct victim of the contact and forced to abandon the race without even completing the first third, would align with the official version that blamed Piastri entirely. But it wasn't like that. Leclerc surprised everyone by declaring that, in his opinion, the blame should not fall exclusively on the McLaren driver. His words were forceful. Oscar was optimistic, but Kimi knew he was on the inside. You don't turn into a curve like there's no one there if you know there's a car on the inside. For me, it was shared. This posture not only shows impressive sporting maturity, but also shows the complexity of an incident that the stewards simplified to a single person responsible. The reaction from the paddock was equally emphatic. Martin Brundle, one of the most influential commentators in Formula One, was quick to describe the penalty as excessive and disproportionate. Brundle, with decades of experience both behind the wheel and analyzing the discipline from the microphones, was clear that the overtaking conditions required a more contextual assessment. According to him, there were mitigating factors that were not properly considered. The fact that Piastri tried to avoid contact, that he braked earlier than his rivals, and that even his wheel lock was a product of the compression caused by Antonelli should have been mitigating elements. The sanction, in his words, seemed to judge the result more than the maneuver itself. Jolyon Palmer was even more direct. He openly questioned the FIA's recent tendency to judge maneuvers according to their consequences. If there had been no contact with Leclerc, would Piastri also have been penalized? He asked. Palmer suggested that the current system does not sufficiently distinguish between a dangerous action and an unfortunate situation, creating legal uncertainty for pilots. What is allowed and what is not? Where is the line that separates a legitimate maneuver from a punishable one? The lack of clarity fuels a climate of fear of competing. Within the circle of active pilots, voices of discontent began to multiply. Although many did not speak directly to the media, inside sources reported that several riders discussed the incident during the post-race GPDA meeting. The consensus was clear. If an action like Piastri's is punished that harshly, then no one can be sure what is allowed in a close fight. A conservation mentality begins to install, where drivers avoid taking risks so as not to receive disproportionate sanctions, thus altering the very essence of wheel-to-wheel competition. Even from within the teams, criticism of the decision was heard. Engineers and sports directors expressed concern about the lack of consistency in the application of the rules. Because the most serious thing about this situation is not only the sanction itself, but the precedent it establishes. If a pilot like Piastri, who applied an aggressive but controlled maneuver in a relaunch context, is penalized so severely, then what are the references for the rest? What kind of message is being sent about how to compete? This incident has opened a crack in the credibility of the FIA. And what was once discussed in hushed tones is now discussed in public. The urgent need for driving guidelines to be interpreted not only with regulatory rigidity, but with contextual understanding with respect for the dynamic complexity of a maneuver in the middle of the race. Because in Formula One, where thousands of a second define championships, justice also needs to be as precise as the cars that star in it. Oscar Piastri arrived in Brazil as one of the main contenders for the championship. His performance in the first races of the year had established him as one of the most consistent drivers in the championship. With a technically refined McLaren and a strategic structure that had been working with precision, the Australian emerged as the most direct rival of his teammate, Lando Norris, who led the standings. But everything changed radically with a 10-second penalty that dragged him to an irrelevant position in the final table of the Brazilian GP, and left him with a disadvantage of 24 points compared to Norris with only 3 rounds remaining until the close of the championship. And that is precisely where the controversy takes on another dimension. Because this sanction, beyond the technical and sporting aspects, modifies the narratives. A championship that was shaping up to be a close battle between two emerging talents, under the same roof and with identical equipment, has lost that balance due to a decision that many consider unfair or, at the very least, disproportionate. The possibility of McLaren winning the driver's title with one of its men has increased, yes, but it has done so at the cost of a sense of injustice that affects the public perception of the championship. Piastri himself, in statements after the incident, revealed his frustration not only because of the sanction, but because of the fact that he felt that he was being punished for trying to compete. In his words, he was not looking to risk more than necessary or endanger his rivals. He simply tried to execute a legitimate maneuver, like so many others that have been seen throughout the history of the Interlagos circuit. From Ayrton Senna to Lewis Hamilton, many champions have built their careers on daring overtakes on that same section of the track. Piastri's punishment is perceived as an alarming message. Competing decisively now can be grounds for severe punishment. The immediate consequence is already clear. Piastri has a mountain to climb in the last 3 rounds of the year. The math is not against him yet, but he needs perfect performances with no margin for error, and hope that Norris does not score decisively. It is a borderline situation, created in large part by a technical interpretation that many within the paddock are openly and publicly challenging. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.